So this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on the Platonic dialogue of the Statesman. So I'd like to jump right into this. A couple things I want to say before we begin. The structure of this is going to be to read 2 pages, interpret them, reflect on them, and then move on to the next 2 pages, and so forth and so on. So we've arrived at a particularly interesting place. We've had many detours so far, necessary detours. And we're getting closer to the point of boiling down a definition for the statesman and for the king, which is our object. Our chief object is the statesman, but the king has wound himself up in there as well. Now the visitor, he says, well then, the king has been separated off from the many sorts of expertise that share his field, or rather from all of them concerned with herds. There remain, we are saying, those sorts of expertise in the city itself that are contributory to contributory causes, and those that are causes which must first divide from each other. Young Socrates says, correct. The visitor, so do you recognize that it is difficult to cut them into 2? The cause, I think, will become more evident if we proceed. Well, then that's what we should do. Then let's divide them limb by limb, like a sacrificial animal, since we can't do it into 2, for we must always cut into the nearest number so far as we can. So how are we to do it in this case? Just as before, the sorts of expertise that provided tools relating to weaving, all of these, of course, we put down then as contributory causes. Yes. We must do the same thing now too, but to a still greater degree than we did then, for we must put down as being contributory causes all the sorts of expertise that produce any tool in the city, whether small or large. Without these there would never come to be a city, nor statesmanship. But on the other hand, we shan't, I think, put down any of them as the product of expertise of the king. No, we shan't. And yet we're trying to do a difficult thing in separating this class of things from the rest. In fact, it is possible for someone to treat anything you like as a tool of something and seem to have said something credible. Nevertheless, among the things people possess in a city, let's treat the following as being a different sort. Different in what way? Because it does not have the same capacity that tools have, for it is not put together with the purpose of causing the coming into being of something, as a tool is, but for the sake of preserving what craftsmen have produced. What do you mean? The varied class of things which is worked for things liquid and solid, and for things that are prepared on the fire, and things that are not, what we refer to with the single name of vessel, a common class, and one that, I think, simply does not belong at all to the sort of expert knowledge we are looking for. Certainly not. We must then observe a third very extensive class of things that people possess, different from these others, which is found on land and on water, moves about a lot and is fixed, and is accorded high value and none, but has a single name, because it is all for the sake of some supporting or other, always being a seat for something. What do you mean? I suppose we call it by the name of vehicle, not at all a product of the art of statesmanship, but much more of those of carpentry, pottery, and bronze working. I see. And what is fourth? Should we say that it is something different from these? Something that includes the larger part of the things we mentioned before, all clothing, most armor, and walls, all those encirclements made out of earth or out of stone, and tens of thousands of other things, since all of them together are worked for the purpose of defending, it would be most apposite to call the whole class of that defense. And it would be thought to be a product of much more of the expertise of the builder and the weaver, most of it, more correctly than it would be thought to belong to that of the statesman. Absolutely. What we want to put down as a fifth class of things to do with decoration, painting, and those representations that are completed by the use of painting and of music, which have been executed solely to give us pleasures, and which would approximately be embraced by a single name. What name? I think we talk about something we call a plaything. Of course. Well, this one name will be fittingly given to all of them, for not one of them is for the sake of a serious purpose, but all done for amusement. This, too, I pretty well understand. And what provides materials for all these things, from which and in which all of the sorts of expertise that have now been mentioned work? A varied class that is itself the offspring of many other sorts of expertise. Shall we not put it down as the sixth? So this is where our 2 pages end. And so now it's time to go back and do some work thinking about where we're going. Philosophically, we're going to be building into this, obviously. We're making more divisions, getting closer to the statesman, getting closer to the king. But nonetheless, I think it still affords us some interesting play field here. Okay, so the visitor at the outset is talking about the king and the various expertise that exist within a city that had been cut off from him already. We have to remember that we are identifying things, the object in mind, the statesman, but the king here too. But it could apply to anything. Things in general, by their relations and by what is in due measure. What is in due measure of a thing is essentially its essence. It's the coherence among the parts. It is the recognition of difference among the parts. But all the same, the picture that emerges from that is the identity of the thing in question. And so when we are saying separating things off or away from the king, what we are trying to do is to get rid of the fog or the brush that is overlying our view of the definition of such an austere figure. Now he brings up these causes. He says, rather, from all of them concerned with herds, there remain, we are saying, those sorts of expertise in the city itself that are contributory causes, and those that are causes, which we must at first divide from each other. So the first question would be, well, what are these causes? We could say, potentially the cause for the king. What has caused him to come into being? And of course, there are various factors that are associated to that, but also, I think, when we think about reality, or just in general, the informational landscape, for which we can attribute anything as being information, if a new bit of information comes into being, there is some cause for it. Now, just because we understand that there may be some cause for it, doesn't necessarily guarantee that we will accurately understand its cause. We could certainly come to a place of falsehood, and the falsehood is made easier by the various associations around, close associations, around that which we are looking for. And actually, much like our example of weaving, it's surprising how many adjacent structures there are to something that we might have otherwise just sort of left associated. But if we had done so, we would probably miss an essence. We would have muddied our definition of what the statesman is or what the king is, just as we would have if we'd left it for the expertise of weaving. So he mentions contributory causes and causes themselves, which have to be divided from each other. Now, not an easy thing, of course, because there are two things that come to mind. A contributory cause that is internal, and a contributory cause that is external to the identity. Internal has to do with the parts, as they contribute things together. It's not just one thing that creates the king. Just like in weaving, there's not one thing that is weaving. There you have your warp and your woof that come together, that are themselves intertwined thread. The intertwining, the process that goes into that, the processing that goes into that, is not weaving itself. So this would be the external, but the act of putting them together is. And I would say even the fibers themselves, the warp and the woof, are not weaving. It is the act of the interweaving of these to make cloth that is weaving. And so, on the surface, as we've most surely seen here, it's quite easy to break off some large chunks before we get down into the nitty-gritty of it. But at the very outset, what we are concerned with are these contributory causes, non-contributory causes, or rather, contributory causes and causes themselves, the direct causes. Now, going back to what I was saying about these contributory causes, so I spoke of internal, and this is something that I need to understand, I think, a little bit better, because a moment ago, in terms of weaving, I said that the warp and the woof is not weaving, which I would agree is not the case, but they participate in weaving. And so too does the interwoven fibers of the warp and the woof. Now, all the processing that occurs before that and the tools that are required to do that do not. They participate adjacently. Now, I think that satisfies this concept of the internal-external. Maybe just say a couple more words about the internal. The warp and the woof, while themselves separate, do not constitute weaving, and as I've mentioned, weaving is more of this act of production that brings something into being. It so fundamentally involves these fibers, as these are the principles that hold the thing together. I'd necessarily call them internal. Now, there's something within this distinction that is not correct, and that is the separation of the contributory causes. Contributory causes, I think, in the sense that the visitor means, is that they are all external, and that the direct causes themselves may be identified in terms of contributory within the body. That bodily structure of the warp and woof is necessary for the process of coming into being to occur, the process for a cloth to come to be. It is required for those principles to be there, to be the first cause of integration of weaving. So in our class here, we have to remember that. The visitor recognizes that it is difficult to cut them into two. He says the cause, I think, will become more evident if we proceed. And it seems like he's starts with all of the contributory causes, getting rid of those first. So he says, just as before, the sorts of expertise that provided tools relating to weaving, all of these, of course, we put down then as contributory causes. Now he does this because the tools often occupy this place that is much before the actual act of the weaving. And again, as I've mentioned, it's within the processing that this takes place, and there are multiple steps of this processing. And just as we can say that there are multiple steps for a human being to come to maturity and to develop a skill and become useful to society, and even up until the level of the human being himself that participates in this thing that necessitates a statesman, it is not really the individual that we are after, because it's not the essence of the statesman. It is what the statesman does to, or what is done to bring the statesman into being. Now, rather fundamental to the art of weaving are those processing stages. Just as in the case of rearing a human being, these are fundamental to the execution of the task of weaving, but they are not the task of weaving. So he says not just the tools, but all the expertise that lead to the production of any tool in the city, whether small or large. These we have to categorize in the class of contributory causes. Now again, it doesn't mean they're not important, because he says without these there would never come to be a city nor statesmanship. But on the other hand, I think we should not put down any of them as the product of the expertise of the king, because indeed they are not. Another thing we have to consider, which I may confuse every once in a while, is the product of the king versus the making of the king. And much like the weaver, we weren't necessarily concerned with the making of the weaver as we were the weaver's art and the production of weaving to make cloth. So the visitor continues and he says, and yet we're trying to do a difficult thing in separating this class of things from the rest. In fact, it is possible for someone to treat anything you like as a tool of something and seem to have said something credible. Now this I want to focus on some. So again, it is possible for someone to treat anything you like as a tool of something. So yes, it is quite difficult in separating those things that seem so close to the object of our attention, and so related to the production, I think, of the object of our attention. That it's almost as if when we think about the products of man, I think we can extend this out farther than that, but since we're talking about man and his society, when we think about his products, whether it be a bookmark, a coin, a television, a guitar, the thing itself, but also the things that were used in its production, can be seen as a tool. For the bookmark serves a particular purpose to preserve the place in a book. The guitar is a tool to make music. The coin is a tool by which we carry value. We can use it to build things. And there are all these subtle sorts of ways in which we can use the products of man as these conceptual tools. And if we trace it all the way back to before we have most of the material goods that we have today, we are left with the bare minimum, just our hands and us ourselves. I think it could be said that man himself can be seen as a tool by which or through which the creative engine of God is exercised. And so it's easy to get lost in that context. The subtlety is often something that is difficult, because subtlety in these matters and a few others that come to mind can at first glance seem like something that is either passive or deceptive, perhaps, in the sense that that which is not understood but depends, the understanding of which depends on experience and time, it's difficult for the mind to accept that it's unable to establish an adequate picture. That includes a degree of certainty as matters of certainty may come about through the participation of physical objects, for example. When we think about something like the king or the statesman, or our investments for retirement, or the way to live a good life, these things can be often shrouded. They are participated in, surely, and there is much room for prudence and discipline and learning. But all the same, there is variability, and it cannot be by that variability that we sacrifice our attention or our focus. And so everything can be seen as a tool, but that frame is not sufficient for us, because then if we viewed things that way, then we would only be looking at things in the relative way of how they are related, and of course we're thinking about their purposes, which are important, but not of the latter sort that we've been introduced to, the core or the essence of the thing in mind. Nevertheless, he says, among the things people possess in a city, let's treat the following as being of a different sort. And so we're introduced now to a bit of nuance. He says it does not have the same capacity that tools have, for it is not put together with the purpose of causing the coming into being of something, as a tool is, but for the sake of preserving what craftsmen have produced. So we have two important terms here. we have coming into being, which is the function of a tool, and we have preserving. Now again, just like you said before, we can take that sort of relative frame and say that, well, the act of preserving surely could be seen at some level like the act of coming into being. It's preserving being. So if being is sort of sacrificed in one aspect, it is reborn in another. So there's this tool quality to it, but we would get lost too readily in that relativism. So now when we think about something that causes something to be, like the weaver that causes cloth to be, the statesman, although he might participate somewhat similarly, of course he has to if we are going to be drawing this parallel between the weaver and the statesman, his product is different. His product is preservation of other products. Now here I sort of wonder at this idea of preservation. I think it gets sort of to the heart of conservatism in a strange way. And I mean it by the sense that what can be conserved is potentially infinite. There are plenty of things for which people value, and it's by their valuing them that they wish to see some element of that thing preserved. And of course, all of us are prone to deception and to falsehood. And so we must necessarily be left open to that possibility for which the principle may not be seen correctly. Now there are various ways in which it may not be seen correctly, some lesser, some more. And there are other ways in which these principles are on the money. They are accurate. They are accurate axioms or principles for which something that ought to be preserved is preserved. Now we spoke of earlier this idea of harmony, the marriage of the parts such that there is a coherent and stable whole. And in an ever undulating experience, much like a flowing river or a bunch of musicians that are all trying to put forth their music into the world, if they don't participate together, it becomes this sort of chaotic mess, a destructive chaotic mess. So I think what is happening here is that the visitor is taking this in a slightly different direction. So in response to this bit about preserving what the craftsmen have produced, young Socrates says, "What do you mean?" The visitor says, "That very class of things which worked for things liquid and solid, and for things that are prepared on the fire, and things that are not, what we refer to with the single name of vessel." So effectively what we've seen here is a large class that encompasses many things to be attributed not to our object, and so they are gotten rid of or removed. And I think it's interesting that we're moving away from that tool analogy because of the potential that everything can be sort of seen as a tool. And so we have this necessary distinction. Well, okay, it's possible that we can see it this way, but there's a particular class of people that have what they participate in, their productive energies, what they produce, is different than the products of those that include all of them together. Again, preserve their products. He gives a third extensive class of things that people possess, different from the others. It's found on land and water. It moves about a lot and is fixed. It has high value and none. It has a single name. And he calls by this a vehicle, not a product of the art of statesmanship, a product of carpentry, pottery, and bronze working. He names a fourth, a larger part of the things mentioned, all clothing, most armor, walls, encirclements. He calls this together defense. The expertise of the builder and the weaver. He mentions a fifth, which are the arts, which he calls a plaything. And he mentions the layer that is beneath all of these, the materials that all of the various sorts of expertise use. This is the sixth. So now we find ourselves on the next page. So I'll read these 2 pages and then continue on the reflection. Young Socrates says, "What exactly are you referring to?" The visitor, "Gold and silver, and everything that is mined, and all that the art of tree felling, and any lopping cuts and provides of the art of the carpenter and the basket weaver, and again the art of stripping off the outer covering of plants, and that one that removes skins from bodies of living things, the art of the skinner, and all sorts of expertise there are in relation to such things, which by producing cork and papyrus and materials for bindings make possible the working up of classes of composite things from classes of things that are not put together. Let us call it all one thing, the firstborn and incomposite possession of mankind, which is in no way a product of the knowledge of kingship." Right. Then again, that sort of possession that consists in nutrition and all those things which are, when they are blended into the body, their own parts with parts of the body, have a capacity for promoting its care, we must say as a seventh, calling it all together nurture, unless we have some more attractive term to propose. And if we place under the arts of the farmer, the hunter, the trainer in the gymnasium, the doctor, and the cook, we shall be assigning it more correctly than if we gave it to the art of the statesman. Of course. Well then, we have, I think, pretty well dealt in these 7 classes with all the things that have to do with possessions, with the exception of tame living creatures. Look at our list. It would be most appropriate if we put down the first-born class of things at the beginning, and after this tool, vessel, vehicle, defense, plaything, nourishment. If anything of no great importance has escaped us, we leave it to one side, because it is capable of fitting into one or other of these. For example, the class consisting of currency, seals, and any sort of engraving, for these do not have any great shared class among them. But if some of them are dragged off into decoration, others into tools, it will be forcibly done, but nevertheless they'll wholly agree to it. As for what relates to possession of tame living creatures, apart from slaves, the art of herd rearing, which we divided into its parts before, will clearly be seen to have caught them all. Absolutely. then what remains is the class of slaves, and all those people who are subordinate to others, among whom I strongly suspect those who dispute with the king about the woven fabric itself will come into view, just as in the case of weaving we found those concerned with spinning and carding, and all the other things we mentioned disputing with the weavers over their product. All the others who have been described as contributory causes have been disposed of along with the products we have just listed, as each was separated off from the practical activity which is the sphere of the art of kingship and statesmanship. So it seems, at any rate, says young Socrates. The visitor, come along, then. Let's get up close to those people that are left and take a look at them, so that we may get a firmer knowledge of them. That's what we should do. Well, those who are subordinate to the greatest degree, looked at from our present perspective, we find the possessing of a function and condition which are the opposite of what we suspected just now. Who are they? Those who are bought and acquired as possessions by this means, people whom we can indisputably call slaves, and who least pretend to kingly expertise. Quite. What then of all those among free men who voluntarily place themselves in the service of those we have been discussing, conveying their products, the products of farming and the other sorts of expertise, between them, and establishing equality between these products, some in marketplaces, others moving from one city to another, whether by sea or by land, exchanging currency both for everything else and for itself, people to whom we give the names of money changers, merchants, ship owners, and retailers. Surely they won't lay claim at all to the art of statesmanship? It may be, perhaps, that they will, to the sort that has to do with commercial matters. The visitor, but those we see placing themselves with complete readiness at the service of all for hire as day laborers, these we shall never find pretending to be kingly expertise. Quite so. What in that case are we to say about those who perform services of the following sorts for us whenever we need them? What services do you mean? And who is it you're talking about? Among others, the tribe of heralds, and all those who become accomplished at writing by having repeatedly given their services to this respect, and certain others who are very clever at working through many different tasks relating to public offices. What shall we call these? What you called them just now, subordinates, and not themselves rulers in cities. But I certainly wasn't dreaming, I think, when I said that somewhere, here and there, would appear those who particularly lay claim to the art of statesmanship. And yet it would seem very odd, indeed, to look for them in some portion of the subordinate arts. Yes, quite. Okay, so today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So we have another class that the visitor puts together. He says materials for bindings make possible the working up of classes of composite things from classes of things that are not put together. Now I think it's going to take me some time to get into this, and I do so rather selfishly because of a particular disposition. It happens to be a Tuesday evening today. Not that it matters all that much, but I think along with these early in the week days, early into the working week, the evenings they can be a bit bittersweet. On one hand, most of the week, the productive week, the working week, is still ahead. And so there is that almost dread and exhaustion that's associated with that. On the other hand, there is a lot of time and opportunity for productive experience, which undoubtedly happens during the week. Now, there were plenty of things that had occurred today, some of them more impactful than others. Now, I suppose as I pause to wonder where exactly to begin this, to center my desires on continuing, one theme that did come up today was the theme of layers. And when I had brought it up, I'm not sure if it really landed in the way that I intended, but nonetheless, I find it again here. In the sense that when we speak of a class, when we speak of some organization of things that are similar, that participate in a similar manner, if we zoom out and we look at the sort of identities of the classes themselves, we could see other classes participating with each other. And I think much like a biological cell, there is some permeability in the membrane of these structures, of these classes. And it's undeniable when we consider the case that these classes can participate together to produce something that requires as its prerequisite the participation in more fundamental classes. And so we have something that is starting quite singular, and then it is brought together into a composite, and it is by that mode of participating in the refinement of singularity that gives rise to the possibility of the refinement of the composite. Now, the visitor calls this the firstborn and incomposite possession of mankind, which is in no way a product of the knowledge of kingship. But again, just because it is not a product of kingship, it doesn't mean that it is not there is no relationship there. I think this is important to understand as we move forward. He says that sort of possession that consists in nutrition and all those things which, when they are blended into the body, their own parts with parts of the body, have a capacity for promoting its care. We must say as a seventh, calling it altogether nurture. Now for this class, I want to think about it in a slightly different way. Not in terms of its relation to statesmanship or to kingship, but rather why we are separating it in the first place. So he says, calling it altogether nurture, unless we have some more attractive term to purpose, and if we are to place it under the arts of the farmer, the hunter, the trainer in the gymnasium, the doctor, and the cook, we shall be assigning it more correctly than if we give it to the art of the statesman. And so this ought to be a simple matter of understanding why we should not give the arts of this type of caring to the art of the statesman. We established a while ago that the statesman is involved in a type of caring, so it's not separate in that sense, but it is separate in the type of caring, that the statesman is responsible for caring for domesticated herds of human beings, whereas the type of caring we see here it seems is an interrelationship with the body. It could be an external source, it could be an internal drive. For example, it may drive one to participate in that gymnastics. It might be involved in some sort of medicine that is consumed, or type of nutrition. The farmer and the hunter are deeply involved in this, and the cook, of course, as well. And so the question is, well, in what way is this type of caring different from the herded type? Well, we can say that one is of the body, but surely the care of the statesman affects the body. We could say that the care of the statesman does not affect the body in the way that what we see here does, and I think that that would be an accurate statement. But it's separate. By what level, by what layer? I think material causes really only help us so far here. Philosophically, I think we can say that the caring for the parts of the body which are subject to the agent is different from a particular agent facilitating the cooperation of other agents. It's a matter of scale, perhaps, of caring. A matter of levels, just as before we had mentioned with the putting together of simpler incomposite materials into something that is composite. Now, in these 7 classes, the visitor says, with all the things that we have to do that have to do with possessions, with the exception of tame living creatures, look at our list. It would be most appropriate if we put down the firstborn class of things at the beginning. So this is our incomposite, our material-based. After this, the tool. After this, the vessel, then the vehicle, then defense, then plaything, then nourishment. And you have to wonder why nourishment is at the end of all of that. If anything of no great importance has escaped us, we leave it to one side, because it is capable of fitting into one or other of these. For example, the class consisting of currency, seals, and any sort of engraving. For these do not have any great shared class among them. But if some of them are dragged off into decoration, others into tools, it will be forcibly done, but nevertheless they'll wholly agree to it. As for what relates to possession of tame living creatures apart from slaves, the art of herd rearing, which we divided into its parts before, will clearly be seen to have caught them all. Now, like a broad web or a broad net, he says that this art of the statesman has encompassed all of this. These other possessions, other types of expertise. Then what's interesting is that we bring up the idea of the slave. The class of slaves and all those people who are subordinate to others, among whom I strongly suspect those who dispute with the king about the woven fabric itself. So what does this mean? What images necessarily are conjured up because of this? For whatever reason, I think about the contemporary difficulties. I suppose in all ages, in all periods, there are people who rebel against things, who protest. But there's nothing like the current era for which the liberal mind is disposed to a type of contrarianism and standing up to something, to some establishment, to something that would tell it to do something, that would subordinate it. But then there's this idea here of a class of people that are associated strongly together because of their subservience. And it's interesting that the subservient class, or the subject class, or the people who are subordinate to others, that these are the ones that will dispute the woven fabric. And now the woven fabric is not something that we've discussed, at least the visitor has not discussed, in any intricate detail, but we've sort of tangentially been exposed to it. And the woven fabric, apart from being this structure by which the statesman or the king can rule and harmonize or tyrannize a society, it is something of a dispute on the relationship among the identities and how they, as I've said, how they relate. And now for this to be coming from one that is subject is a curious matter. One, you wouldn't think that they would be in a position, nor would their mind wish to be in a position or understand it to be in a position to wish to dispute such a thing. Secondly, I have to wonder about subjection, the nature of subjection, and what that does to the mind. Now, as with all things, there are good sides of things. There's a positive road and there is a negative road. Maybe there's three, and there's a road of curiosity where we're not quite sure, but still leads us down these two roads. Now, it is my belief that we are all subject to something. And I don't think that being subject is inherently a negative thing. But there are those that I think view their subjection as negative, even if it is their natural place. That their qualities or their station, the time and the skills that they have acquired is sufficient to warrant themselves a state of subjection. The awareness of potential unfairness or the liberties of others can excite jealousies and frustration, and one can certainly understand how it would be possible for a subject to dispute his subjection with a ruler or one that he is subject to, even at the level of the woven fabric. Now the visitor continues, he says, just as in the case of weaving we found those concerned with spinning and carding and all other things we mentioned disputing with the weavers over their product. All the others who have been described as contributory causes have been disposed of along with the products we have just listed, as each was separated off from the practical activity which is the sphere of the art of kingship and statesmanship. So we come back to this idea of those that are close to the weaver wanting to take credit for or to participate in the fundamental process of producing the product, the product of the statesman or the product of the king. And it's because of their close relation that they feel uniquely qualified. They do have a particular perspective, because I think the carder, or anyone who is involved in the pre-processing of materials that go into the weaver's hands, there is quite a wealth of information there. And so I think about here the bureaucrat that participates in stately affairs, but does not execute the type of actions that are necessary to create the products of the weaver or the statesman. But in this way, I have to wonder if the visitor is trying to draw that comparison between those who are subject to others and that of the spinner or of the carder, being somebody that is so close to the production of cloth, and yet they themselves are not responsible in it. I suppose there is a relationship, because the subject, although there are various layers of subjection, we're talking about a particular one in which they don't necessarily participate in the harmony that is created by the statesman. Their efforts are controlled. He says, those who are bought and acquired as possessions by this means, people whom we can indisputably call slaves, and who least pretend to kingly expertise. So the road that we are taking here is not immediately clear. On one hand, we're speaking about, in greater detail, the subjected class. And there's this sort of loose association to that of the proximal or approximate classes of people that are responsible for production, but don't necessarily, but are not the people who produce the end result. And we get into the conversation about discussing those who take or purchase products in exchange with others, these sort of money changers, the merchants, this class of people. The visitor says these people won't lay claim to the art of the statesman. And then we have another sort of subordinate class, who are the day laborers. He says these people probably won't have much of an issue with it. He says, what in that case are we to say about those who perform services of the following sorts for us whenever we need them? The tribe of heralds, and all those who become accomplished at writing by having repeatedly given their services in this respect, and certainly others who are very clever at working through many different tasks relating to public offices. What shall we call these? The young Socrates refers to them as subordinates, and not themselves rulers. So this type of subject is what I had mentioned earlier. It is that of the bureaucrat, that of the close association, those who study the political arts. Perhaps even the journalists find themselves close to this domain. And so the visitor says, well, okay, so we've been searching a little bit here. We were maybe a little concerned about the slaves as the potential for the classic slave uprising, for which they come to some understanding about their subjection and inferiority, and they lay claim to that desire to rule because they know better. They understand what the limits of individual sovereignty means, or whatever the case might be. And so he's like, I'm close to putting my finger on the dial. He says, but I certainly wasn't dreaming, I think, when I said that somewhere here there would appear those who particularly lay claim to the art of statesmanship, and yet it would seem very odd instead to look for them in some position of the subordinate arts. And so he wants to get even closer now, past this point. And so here I'll read the next 2 pages. He says, then let's get still closer to those we haven't yet cross-examined. There are those who have a part of a subordinate sort of expert knowledge in relation to divination, for they are, I believe, considered to be interpreters from gods to men. Yes. And then, too, the class of priests, in its turn, has a custom, as custom tells us, expert knowledge about the giving through sacrifices of gifts from us to the gods, which are pleasing to them, and about asking from them for through prayers for the acquisition of good things for us. I imagine that both of these things are parts of a subordinate art. It appears so, at any rate. Well now, it seems to me that at this point we are, as it were, getting close to some sort of trail leading to our destination. For the type of priests and seers is filled full of self-importance and gets a lofty reputation because of the magnitude of what they undertake, so that in Egypt it is not even permitted for a king to hold office without also exercising that of priest. If in fact he happens to have acceded to power at the beginning by force from another class, it is later necessary for him to be initiated into the class of priests. And again among the Greeks too, in many places, it is to the greatest offices that one would find being assigned to the performance of the greatest of sacrifices in relation to such things. And in fact, what I'm saying receives the clearest illustration in your case. For they say that the most solemn and ancestral of the ancient sacrifices are assigned here to the person who becomes king by lot. And there's a footnote. At Athens, one of the archons, or chief magistrates, had the title of King Archon. Most certainly, responds young Socrates. Now the visitor continues, well then, we must look both at these king priests by lot and their subordinates, and also at a certain other very large crowd of people which has just become visible to us, now that the previous ones have been separated off. But who are the people you mean? Says young Socrates. Some very odd people, indeed, says the visitor. How, exactly? It's a class mixed out of all sorts, or so it seems to me as I look at it just now. And very many resemble satyrs, and those animals that are weak but versatile. And they quickly exchange their shapes and capacity for action for each other's. And yet now, Socrates, I think I have identified the men in question. Please explain. You seem to have something odd in view. Yes, it's universal experience that not recognizing something makes it odd. And this is exactly what happened to me just now. At the moment when I first saw the chorus of those concerned with the affairs of cities, I failed to recognize them. What chorus? That of the greatest magician of all the sophists, and the most versed in their expertise. Although removing him from among those who really are in possession of the arts of statesmanship and kingship is a very difficult thing to do, remove him we must if we are going to see plainly what we are looking for. We must certainly not let this slip. Not, if you ask in my view, so tell me this. What? We recognize monarchy, don't we, as one of the varieties of rule in cities? Yes. After monarchy, one would, I think, list the holding of power by the few. Of course. And isn't a third type of constitution ruled by the mass of the people called by the name of democracy? Most certainly. So there are 3 of them, but don't they in a certain way become 5, giving birth from among them the 2 other names in addition to themselves? What are these? I think that as things our people refer to the aspects of force and consent, poverty and wealth, and law and lawlessness, as they occur in them, and use these to divide each of the first 2 types into 2. So they call monarchy by 2 names, on the grounds that it exhibits 2 forms, one tyrannical and the other kingly monarchy. Of course. In any city which has come to be controlled by a few people, they call by the names of aristocracy and oligarchy. Most certainly. With democracy, on the other hand, whether in fact it's by force or with their consent that the mass rules over those who possess the wealth, and whether by accurately preserving the laws or not, in all these cases, no one is in the habit of changing its name. True. What then? Do we suppose that any of these constitutions is correct, when it is defined by these criteria, one, few, and many, wealth and poverty, force and consent, and whether it turns out to be accompanied by written laws or without laws? Why? What actually prevents it? Look at it more clearly, following this way. Which? Says young Socrates. Okay, so what can we make of these 2 pages? So here I want to take some time and to think about the exchange that we had on the last page. This word subordinate is at the center of our attention at the moment. It comes from Latin origins, the word subordinate. The root subordinatus, the past participle of subordinare, formed from the prefix sub, which is under or beneath, and ordinare, to arrange, set in order. So we have this idea of placing beneath in rank or order. And so I think we'll stick with the rooted sense for now. We don't necessarily have to go on to later evolutions of the term. Not long ago, I was discussing how when we entered into these ideas of the subservient classes, that there was a bit of, not necessarily inconsistency, but there was a sense of liberality with the analogies that we were using. We mentioned the slave, we mentioned the merchant class, we mentioned a few other sorts of characters. Money changers. And it came down to, I suppose, a few ideas. in one sense, we have an agent that has a degree of autonomy stripped to them, or their autonomy is rather given to them by one that is higher in their rank. We have a class of people that are more dependent rather than subservient or subject to, and their dependence may rest on the production of a particular expertise. And of course, in our societies, this is layered, so we all have some level of dependence, level of subordination. There are those within these classes that may be more apt to dispute with the king about a way of seeing or a way of ruling. But we've come to an important class of people, and one I think that throughout the ages has had an intimate relationship between themselves, the ecclesiastical, and the civil institutions, often overlapping. And I don't think that it can be overstated how important the ecclesiastical is to a society, even though it may seem that in the historical context, their various disputes with the civil authority may sour the mind against their occupation. So there are those who have a part of a subordinate sort of expert knowledge in relation to divination, for they are, I believe, says the visitor, considered to be interpreters from gods to men. The class of priests has expert knowledge about giving through sacrifices of gifts from us to the gods, which are pleasing to them. So let's think about what this involves. A big part of why I sit here and do this every night is because I want to be connected to something greater, something more meaningful and purposeful. And there's a certain art, I think, to self-reflection and coming to understand things that are valuable. And there's a way of coming to be that I think has a degree of universality to it, or maybe I should say that there is ground to it. There's a way in which we can measure progress ontologically towards a better orientation, for a more peaceful disposition, and a more productive character. And of the sorts of people that we consider now, the priests, and the exchange that necessarily takes place here, the giving through sacrifices of gifts from us to the gods, which are pleasing to them. It's easy for the contemporary mind to view this on the outside and to see it artificially or superficially as people who oriented themselves in such a way by superstitious means that they didn't really understand what they were doing. But of course, we can't relate ourselves this way, otherwise we wouldn't understand. And then I think that there is a much stronger relationship here than the contemporary mind gives credit. And while superstition may exist in parallel to those things, to those technologies or tools that are almost indispensable either to mind or the cohesiveness of a society, it ought not to be our pursuit to deny the parallel that is good. So let's talk a little bit then, in the productive spirit, about these sacrifices and gifts. So I'm going to use ChatGPT to give us some historical context, and then we're going to speak, hopefully, in a little bit more philosophical language about what this means and how I'm relating myself to it. So in the ancient Greek world, sacrifice, or thisia, or thyin, to make smoke, to burn in offering, was the central act of religion. It was not primarily penitential or transactional, but communal, a way of affirming harmony between God's city and man. The act itself, an animal, often a domesticated one like a sheep or an ox, was garlanded, purified, and slain over an altar. The smoke rising heavenward symbolized a bridge between mortal and divine realms, the gods receiving their share, the burnt fat, bones, or steam, and the humans sharing the cooked meat in sacred meal. The gifts, or dora, and libations, spondi, these include wine, honey, grain, or incense. They were understood as restoring charis, or reciprocal favor, between the divine and the human. The priests were not theologians in the later sense. They were ritual technicians. Their techne was the knowledge of what was pleasing, which forms of offering, posture, or word restored the delicate equilibrium between order and chaos. This knowledge of the priestly class was hereditary in some cities. Athens had specific priestly families for Athena, for example, but also civic. The priesthood belonged to the polis, and not an independent church. The priestly craft is one kind of care, a governance that mediates between mortal and immortal orders. Not political rule, but ontological mediation. So the priestly art, in other words, is a kind of in-between practice that ties the visible world to the intelligible. Sacrifice is the symbolic reenactment of the cosmos, dependency on the good. Everything that exists offers itself back, in gratitude, acknowledging that its being is received, not self-created. Prayer is the inverse gesture, the soul's ascent, turning towards the divine for guidance, while sacrifice is the divine's descent into participation. So speaking of the cosmological rotations that we saw earlier with the analogy to Cronus, through the giving through sacrifices and gifts, and the asking through prayers, we have a completion of the circuit, the ascending motion of longing and praise, and the descending motion of grace and order. And so when we consider this sacrificing, the gift giving, and the praying, all of this not only for, but involving the acquisition of good things, there's a type of care, I think, that exists here. And perhaps a type of care for the collective. And since the priest is involved in this mediation between the divine realm and the human realm, and is so closely related to those ontological expressions, or those expressions of man's being, which is everything that he comes to be, his relationship to himself, the things that he believes to be valuable, what he considers to be right and wrong, how he treats his neighbors, how he treats his family members, how he can access his own heart, his relationship to God. There's a lot, I think, wound up in that. We are complex beings, and it's quite easy to get in this sort of complacent status in life. And there's nothing like a little bit of complacency to blind the eyes to other things, but also not just otherness, but good things, and of course also bad things. But the point being is the change that is the potential change that is involved, or the potential that exists innately in the human soul, is vast, and there's something quite profound, I think, that can be tapped into there. It's not an easy thing, and it's a very subtle thing. It involves a type of weaving just as much, I think, as the Statesman, but not in the same domain. And this is sort of where we are, trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we separate this sort of ecclesiastical from the civil? What is it about these sacrifices and the prayers that separates the care of the priest from that of the statesman? Because surely the statesman gives something of himself for a greater harmony among the collective, in order to understand others and not just have a selfish outlook on things. It would be quite difficult to harmonize if one were to reject the very notion of harmonization, because they believe that their own pursuit or path and the vibrations, the interactions among the people ought to be controlled, or whatever the situation is. And harmony in that sense is something that would be artificial. It would not be something that naturally occurs among a guided collective. Now, going back to the priest and the matter of these sacrifices, there is this idea of giving up and receiving as a result. In my mind, again, it's a mind that is steeped in a material society, a largely a religious society, but that is changing. Now, I have a problem with saying a religious, because religion is everywhere, and I think it would be more accurate to say that it is a nominal age for which people don't really know what they believe, what they worship. We are taught that the self can orient all of that and sacrifice to itself, sacrifice to its own desires, and only to its own desires. And so that brings us to an unfortunate place where we deny otherness, we deny relationality, and I think we even, to a certain point, deny ground. It makes us difficult to see the essence of things. The essence of things as it relates to the purpose of things. I'm thinking back to what we've spoken of about due measure, and how this fundamentally comprises the identity of something. But it may also exist compartmentally. There may be parts to it, and this balance of identification for the thing that is, and not to get lost in the parts, nor to get overly zealous about the foreign relatedness, the things at the margin that are related to it, that influence it, change it to a degree, but don't destroy the identity, that we are able to see that thing that is stable, that exists on its own. And for the priest, I think he plays in this arena. Like I said, he's a weaver of sorts. He facilitates, he mediates between the going up and the coming down. Quite a difficult thing to do. But as I've started just a moment ago by saying that I have a particular mind and a particular relationship and association to this, that although I may be changing steadily as I learn and as I read and reflect, there is still an aspect of my mind that struggles with exactly what it means when somebody sacrifices in such a manner as to put an animal on the altar, and to have the smoke rise in a symbolic manner, indicating that we are giving something to the spirit realm, let's say. Now we separate this, I think, to a degree from the physical structure of things. I don't think it can be completely separated, but at least as far as I'm concerned, I, at this moment, have difficulty understanding the interconnectedness of that. But as far as the mind is concerned, and the symbolic play or ritual that it engages in, this is fundamental. For it is by this experience that we reorient ourselves to the divine. And if we reorient ourselves to it, not only do we see it, not only do we proposition it, hopefully begin to love it, but we also begin to understand error, we begin to understand relatedness, and the very structure by which we would understand that which is false. And by seeing in greater resolution, we can further commit ourselves to a posturing towards goodness, towards productivity. And while in some minds it may seem self-evident that this should be the case, I think in other cases, and in most cases, the disposition of mind is something that needs to be worked on. It needs to be improved. It needs to be given a purpose, and there needs to be a natural web of participation. And this web of participation is that sort of connection not only to the other individuals, but also the individuals to the divine logos. And so the visitor says, I imagine that both of these things are part of a subordinate art. Now, subordinate. Now we think of a rank and an ordering. That is, there is this axis, there is this ground that permeates all of it, and at some place there is a priest on that axis around which he rotates. He submits himself to something. Submits himself to God, or submits himself to the mediation of divine order to human hands. And so he says, at this point we're getting close to some sort of trail leading to our destination. For the type of priests and seers is filled full of self-importance and gets lofty reputation because of the magnitude of what they undertake. So that in Egypt it is not even permitted for a king to hold office without also exercising that of a priest. So quite a dilemma, it would seem, As a child is born, and as a child takes on things more of their own and less of their parents, less dependent on their parents, they become something new. And here I pause and I wonder about the separation between the priest and the king, and the priest and the statesman, but also the unification between the two. It's not difficult for me to imagine what it would mean necessarily. Well, maybe it is difficult to imagine, but we've just explored to a degree, I think, the purpose of the priest. We didn't necessarily explore the purpose of the king. We've been talking a lot about it, but going around sort of tangentially. Now, the experience of a king, of a monarch, is different from the priest, but also there is overlap. They are head of state. They're responsible for a certain type of order. They are a subordinate to that order, the civil order. And in the case of the union between the king and the priest, they're responsible for the civil order, but the divine order. And they're responsible for connecting the two together. And such a responsibility it is. Seemingly impossible for one person to do. But that would also mean that they are a conduit for a lot of information. They mediate divine information to human hands, from human hands to the divine. And at the same time, they mediate the information of character, now here it's difficult because in terms of harmonizing citizens, there is religious territory here, almost in an inseparable measure. And I think part of the reason is because what is in the religious domain is so broad. For what we call religious is that which binds. Now we may make a distinction about that which binds secularly, which is hard enough to distinguish, but if there's a civil apparatus that is associated to that, it is hardly something that can be considered secular. But as far as it is possible of having a rule of law that is impartial, then I suppose we would say that it is secular, but only because of its impartiality. But it leaves nature to decide, in a sense. And I hope I'm not going too far afield here. And I know that I'm attributing to this perhaps advances in governance that are more unique to our era, but perhaps not. I've yet to be certain of that. So let's think about this in a little bit greater detail, because we haven't really got to the heart of the matter yet. Speaking of the king and speaking of the priest, the central idea of mediation. So, the mediate is that which connects without conflating. It is sort of free of the sophist. It doesn't mix when mixture is not warranted. It holds difference and unity together, an interval that allows relation. So to mediate is to make participation possible. Between thought and reality, reason mediates the world to the mind. Between human and divine, ritual logos, priesthood, or mediating arts. Between the many and the one, measure mediates excess and deficiency. So today happens to be a new day, and I'm not sure how long this segment is going to last, but it's important to get this in nonetheless. For the life of me, I'm having difficulty remembering exactly where I left off. Of course, I listened to the last bit of that recording, and I know generally what I was thinking about in terms of mediation, but I can't really remember what tributary I went down. So, we might have to go around a little bit here and see what happens. So, I'm still thinking about this second paragraph, which again reads, "And then too the class of priests, in its turn, has, as custom tells us, expert knowledge about the giving through sacrifices of gifts from us to the gods which are pleasing to them, and about asking from them through prayers or the acquisition of good things for us. I imagine that both of these things are part of a subordinate art." Now this last bit, the subordinate art, of which again we've mentioned a few things, I find it difficult to come outside of this and imagine things that are not subordinate arts. When I'm thinking about the priest and thinking about mediation, there are different levels of this mediation. And we're all subordinate to a certain degree to the next level of being. And perhaps I'm being unkind to the particulars, in the sense that I do understand that this subordination, while it may be true that many of us participate in a subordinate manner to something, we all do, we all must, it is not necessarily the same as the priest who acts as the mediator. Now, from the last segment of recording, I spent some time thinking about the word mediate. And what we have is this idea of the priest that stands between, not between as a lack of harmony, but to facilitate that harmony, stands between to mediate such that the information can appropriately pass through. It is to create a middle so that relation can exist. If there is to be a separation among these layers of a higher order of being and of a lower order of being, then there must necessarily be a mediator at each level, at each layer. Now, whether this takes the form of a priest or an intelligent agent, I don't know. But the point is that in order to have that connection between difference and unification, there has to be something that attracts and facilitates, whatever that happens to be. There are plenty of things that we possess that attract and facilitate, but don't possess the type of agency that a human being does. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the hierarchy of participation. Different degrees of order. At the top we have the One, or the Good. Its character is pure actuality. It is the source of all order. Its mode of being is absolute, beyond form or distinction. And this is God, or the Good itself. Next, we have the intelligible realm. We have the perfect forms, eternal patterns. Its mode of being is unchanging and known by intellect. An example of this would be beauty, justice, circle, man in himself. Next we have the psychic, or the soul realm. It is the mediation between the eternal and temporal. It is dynamic, moves, reasons, lives. It has the rational soul and the cosmic soul. Below that we have the physical, the sensible realm. Its character is a mixture of being and becoming. It is mutable, perceived through senses. An example would be living bodies, elements, artifacts. And the last level of order is the material substrate, which is bare potentiality. Its mode of being is almost non-being, pure receptivity. It's chaotic and matter without form. So we can see how there is this progression of being flowing downward. That at the top there is this necessity for creation and order, and it percolates throughout the whole. At our level, we remember. We move, we return back upwards. Now when I read the lowest order, I can't help but to think and reflect on a couple things about our contemporary age and our primary, what we would call, maybe we would call our theological or lack thereof, narrative, our mythological structure. And it's that of a scientism. It is a story built on the production of something from nothing. Order that instead of having a connection to a type of order that is purposeful and directed, it is rather just purely emergent. And it just seems that when we think about such things, that the story that we are currently living in and through as the dominant narrative, not saying that all of us believe in this story per se, elements of it sure, but this dominant narrative is, it seems to me, to be but a part of a much broader experience. The experience of which we are surely a small part of, but we are also in a unique position because we have this sort of interchangeable, dynamic experience. We are of body, we are born into body, and yet we have soul. We have the taste of the eternal within us. And it creates such a friction in life, so many difficulties with understanding who we are, where we are, how we should act, what we should value, how to orient ourselves. Some are more concerned with this than others. Some are just sort of caught by the winds of it all and just go with it, whether it be good or bad. So I think I was at this point before. I still can't quite remember. But the visitor says, "Well now, it seems to me that at this point we are, as it were, getting close to some sort of trail leading to our destination. For the type of priest in Seers is filled full of self-importance, and gets a lofty reputation because of the magnitude of what they undertake, so that in Egypt it is not even permitted for a king to hold office without also exercising that of a priest. So here I remember thinking about a little bit of frustration in the sense that we haven't explored the king in the type of depth that I would like to have explored him. And perhaps we should think about it in some detail now. The first thing that comes to mind is, in particular of English history, the ways in which the kings throughout the ages have been aligned. I think there's a way in which the institution of the kingship is steady, and yet all the same, as times change, sometimes the institution and the king himself takes a more central role, sometimes a more passive, guided role by the part of his advisors. Symbolically, there remains this important seat, though, of the throne. And on top of this throne sits a person that wields the power of that institution. And I have to ask the question, well, what does that mean? In a sense, it means that they have broad civil powers. They have influence over law. The king's prerogative in certain ages were equivalent to the force of law. In other ages, it required the consent of Parliament, or a mixture of barons and, to a lesser degree, the commons. But as times changed, the role of the commons shifted. In the old monarchy of the Roman government, before the Republic, before the imperial age, the kings were more or less elected. And still yet, there was this importance and value placed on the position of that person. The influence that the king and the associates that are around him, propped up by the blood, let's say, the blood and various nobility that have been successful in one way or another. I don't think there's any doubt that it can be said of the king that that person holds a strong symbolic role, and that the symbolic role is akin to a mediator. There's a sort of intra-mediation that occurs between the civil authority and the populace. But as we see here, there's an intermixing of that of the ecclesiastical, or of the religious, whatever word we want to use. Now, of the civil, we're speaking about the mediation of concerns that are within a particular order of participation in being. In the case of the civil, the king is not necessarily, in terms of purely civil pursuits or concerns, the king is not, his attention is not on that mediation between the divine or the participation in order above, but he is rather focused on the order that exists within the structure that he governs. And so there are necessarily a lot of quite practical things that are involved here, like infrastructure, the minting of monies, regulation of trade. Leadership, I think, falls in that to a degree in the civil apparatus. But the marriage between the two is something altogether different, because now you have a mediator to the divine that attempts to harmonize the ontology of the populace to a broader pattern that has some cosmological constancy or order to it. And ultimately, if the king is good, that pattern that they're most attended to, that they worship, is going to be the good. So I want to run through this again with another perspective, perhaps. The visitor says, "For the type of priest and seers is filled full of self-importance and gets a lofty reputation because of the magnitude of what they undertake. So that in Egypt it is not even permitted for a king to hold office without also exercising that of a priest." So, what pulls at me for some reason when I see this, when I read it the first time, it was this idea that the type of priests and seers is filled full of self-importance. And I sort of wonder what that means, to be filled with self-importance. Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Or can it be a bit of both? Now, on one hand, the self is a dangerous sort of thing. The self is always in relation to other things. We remember that there's a certain point at which that which is, when it cuts or attempts to cut itself off from that which is not, or differentiation, it becomes sclerotic and it erodes. It becomes less effective of an agent. I think in large measure because it can't participate appropriately in reality. For it has a body, it has obligations and responsibilities. On the other hand, if we had priests and seers that had a self surely, but that self was not filled with some sort of important attention, then they would not have been in any position to do anything useful at all in society. And I think it goes to show that what is valuable is actually where the attention goes. And the funny thing is, it often goes to where the attention is mediated, but as far as on the lower level, on the level of the material, the medium of money that holds value. It is this that people often seek, but at the end of that is productive potential. It is something to be done. And I sort of wonder if men get lost in the pursuit of that money, or if the conquering of money is seen by them as a secondary step to do the purposes that they have in mind. I think that probably in our experiences there's a little bit of both. There's always the superficial and vain, and the productive, proactive engineering types. So this gives us an idea, I think, of if the self of the priest and the seer is to be strongly attended to by society for just purposes, that there's a recognition of the importance of a person that is there to guide information, maybe. It's kind of hard to say, because then the mind goes to, well, surely they're guiding a bottleneck of information. But again, mediate is a bringing together. It is a bridging, appropriately, of the self and of the relations that abut it, but also that it ought to attend to. If it has a stronger relationship to a productive partner, then the agent is positively benefited from that. Again, we established the idea that above a certain threshold, below a certain threshold, the identity falls into nothingness. Above that threshold, the identity is within itself, and it suffocates itself. And so this sweet spot, this harmony of maintaining identity while not sacrificing the nourishment of difference, let's say. This is the harmony that exists here. And so, back to what I was thinking about this individual not of being too singular, having too much responsibility. Perhaps it's quite an American thought, but I have to think that it is a dangerous thing in case this person is wrong about something. But all the same, I think there's a little bit more subtlety involved in this, a little bit more sophistication. What does that mean? Much like we speak of now, I think much to my disappointment about the goings on of things in the contemporary age, that is so in need of that strong methodological roadmap to life, not in just one area, but in many simultaneously, to promote that wellness of being and connectedness of soul. I have to imagine nonetheless that the picture that we see, if possible, under the constraints that we are given, must be sufficiently broad to encompass a variety of experience, as we are considering harmonization, and not one human being is an identical puzzle piece. So there has to be a unique process by which one undergoes a spiritual or religious transformation. And this unique process is perhaps guided and directed, but the guiding and directing is such a difficult thing. And I think it has to do mostly with the expansion methodologically, perhaps by reflection, by orientation, by practice, such that the self and the heart within it unfolds, it grows, sort of like the practice is the substrate through which our consciousness expands. But of course it doesn't end there. It's something that carries on through the day, through the weeks and the years. It is something that itself evolves. It is not just a static thing, a static practice. And of course there's much danger in there. But with danger we can paint a lot of pictures. We can make ourselves a lot of warnings. And now to add on to this, if in fact he happens to have acceded to power at the beginning by force from another class, it is later necessary for him to be initiated into the class of priests. And again among the Greeks too, in many places, it is to the greatest offices that one would find being assigned the performance of the greatest of sacrifices in relation to such things. And in fact, what I'm saying receives the clearest illustration in your case. For they say that the most solemn and ancestral of the ancient sacrifices are assigned here to the person who becomes king by lot. Now, I think what the visitor is talking about here is the attribution of the foundational myths. That when we have these, or in general, king/priest figure, we potentially have the foundation of a society, of a particular line of people, and the purpose then of the sacrifice is to remember that story, to remember that narrative. But let's zoom out a little bit and think about sacrifices in general, because I think it can also mean consideration of those sacrifices, again, in general, of the populace, for numerous, varied reasons. So, one ritual that preserves a kind of archaic aura is the bouphonia, or ox slayings, in Athens. During the Athenian festival of the Diploea, an ox is selected, sometimes by its own action of eating offerings, and slaughtered subsequently. The actor who kills it must abandon the axe and flee, indicating the guilt or sacrificial weight of the act. So I suppose there are 1,000,001 ways in which we can identify historically and contemporarily these types of sacrifices, institutional or otherwise. Now, there are two things that come to mind here. One is that I think what the visitor is referring to here is foundational sacrifices. These are those sacrifices that have occurred in a collective agent's history that will always be remembered as long as the identity of that thing is coherent. The second thing I think about is the role of sacrifice on the smaller end of that fractal scale. So if we can imagine our experiences, the light of our mind, and the expression of our souls as being unique in this experience, and it is something that from this experience we can reflect on the broader pattern of things, I think it is important to spend some time thinking about in what ways do we sacrifice regularly, and perhaps in what way is this ritualized for those of us who do not regularly attend an institution by which they consciously undergo these sacrifices, whether practiced, acted symbolically, or otherwise? So I thought of the word sacrifice, and I decided to look up the etymology of the term. It comes from the Latin, from sacer, meaning holy, sacred, to set apart for the gods, and facere, to make or to do. So the act of making something sacred. Now that doesn't help us too much because we don't have a solid definition of what it means for something to be sacred. But let's think about the root. So we're taking something, we're setting it apart, we're putting it somewhere. And of this, the other part of this root, to make or to do, I think there's a lot that is wound up in there, a lot of potential that is wound up in there. Now, with anything, if I am, let's say if I'm going to interact with my cell phone, I'm setting apart attention, and I'm doing a particular behavior. There's some purpose, there's some direction behind it. Now, when we bring the holy into this experience, it changes the dynamic, because it removes most trivial matters. It retains for itself those types of experience that afford us with a type of opening, perhaps, through which we come to a greater understanding of something, but in particular a greater understanding of that which is, and in particular from that, I think a greater understanding of that which is in relation to other things that are, but is grounded within that stabilizing goodness of the divine logos, of the divine ordering principle. The ordering principle that scales at multiple levels, that doesn't just stop with our perception or our, what we would call now as subjective experience, but rather something that has continuity to the whole. Something that doesn't deny agency, it promotes it, but at the same time, it is careful to not let that which is become sclerotic and devolve into itself. Now, as far as the sacrifices are concerned, I think we are sacrificing all of the time. Perhaps not always to the most holy of things. There's certainly a subtlety involved here. But if we are to set apart something, whether it be an object or our attention, and I think if we are going to set aside an object, it's going to involve our attention, so we might as well just say to set apart our attention for something in order to make something. What is it that we are making? We could think about this making sort of as an intra-perspective or an inter-perspective, or both, in the sense that, especially as we consider the statesman and of the king, the inter-perspective, or the relationship among more than one thing, more than one agent, more than one identity, is paramount. But of course, the individual and how the individual is constituted is not something that is denied either in this approach or in this thought. Of the two, we can imagine the weaver's scenario and the complexities of the interwoven fibers of each case. Now, when we consider orientation and harmony, what we wish is that I don't want to be too circular here, but what we wish is that we give those things up that would otherwise limit us to a state of complacency, of stasis. I think can be a degree a good thing, but I think also it can be bad, so a degree of stasis perhaps. Stasis in the sense that our failures go unchecked and uncorrected. The orientation of a proper sacrifice facilitates that orientation to correcting fallacious modes of thought. This experience that I have right now is as a type of sacrifice. I'm giving up that draw, that desire to attend to other things that are more base and less intellectual. Even though I haven't really said anything all that intellectual in the last few minutes, it is nonetheless a mental exercise of attention and focus. So I suppose my primary object here is the consideration that the individual, myself as I experience life, my orientation towards anything involves this allocation of attention, and then the productive output of the making or doing of whatever it happens to be towards a particular end, towards a particular due measure of that which is good, and that goodness is an ever-unfolding process. It's an ever-unfolding experience by which good things are seconded by bad things. The desires are constantly being adjusted in the short and long term to adapt to those realizations. And the sacrifices provide an opportunity to bring the mind away from those absent experiences. While in the moment, it does not consider the dread of wasted experience, but rather it is content to consume itself within itself, to cut off its connection to the divine experience in order to gratify its own base desires. And as far as I'm concerned, the satisfaction of these base desires has quite a wide reach, and that pacification and peace is not a simple matter. Sometimes it can seem quite torturous when one is not engaged in anything productive. And sometimes it could seem like the threshold to productive behavior is something in and of itself limiting. But those sacrifices, I think, get us to that activation threshold that pushes us over and away from the lethargy of experience or the passivity of experience. For they say that the most solemn and ancestral of ancient sacrifices are assigned here to the person who becomes king by lot. Now, by lot is a random situation. We could say that it is by fate that a particular person is put in this position. And I don't necessarily think that we have to think about this as a throwing up of the hands and a complete arbitrary practice. I think that there are many conditions that surround us that give us those constraints by which we are led down certain roads and paths to a particular posture. Much of it depends on our relation to this, whether to accept or to deny. But in what he sees, I understand that the solemn and ancient sacrifices are something that comes from beyond, and that if somebody is chosen in this way, sort of the events are sort of perfect for an individual to take on what seems to be presented by so many external factors to any one person's control that it seems divinely given or provided to be acted on by this person. And time will tell if indeed this solemn and ancestral sacrifice is to hold up, if it is to carry the meaning and the weight appropriate to that divine orientation. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, and we'll continue next time with part 11.